Hello, Shades here. I was working on a video for my Minute History playlist when the horrific terrorist attacks on Paris hit the news. France is such an important country in the development of world history and culture, with many great heroes and heroines coming from within its borders. Therefore, instead of choosing one great historical figure for this week's video, I've decided to talk very briefly about some of the many great French historical figures that helped shape and define our world today. I would like to dedicate this video to the people of Paris. Let's begin in the 15th century, at the height of the 100 Years' War, with arguably France's greatest heroine, Joan of Arc. It was one of France's darkest hours. The king, Charles VI, was dead, and his son, Charles, had yet to be crowned. England had invaded France, and after 50 years of nearly continuous warfare, were close to taking the French throne. It was during this turbulent time that a young 14-year-old peasant girl began to hear voices in her head. The young Joan believed that the saints Michael, Catherine, and Mary were talking to her, telling her that it was her destiny to save France from the English. Whatever we believe the voices were is inconsequential. The important thing is that Joan believed in them, and so passionately did she speak that this 14-year-old peasant girl was able to convince powerful noblemen that she spoke true. She was able to convince the son of the now deceased king himself, who had her ride out at the front of his armies, battle axe in hand. Such an inspiration to the troops was this young girl, clad in gleaming white armour, that the French forces rallied around her, and the English were routed at Orleans. The tide of the war thus began to change. Charles was crowned Charles VII, and Joan was hailed as the saviour of France. And so Joan would ride from conflict to conflict, boosting French morale wherever she was present, and urging the French army to ever greater feats of bravery, though not always to victory. Unfortunately, later on in the war, Joan was captured by the Burgundians en route to help the besieged town of Compiègne and sold to the English. Tried for heresy, Joan was given two choices: retract her statements that she was divinely led and face imprisonment, or do no such thing and be burned at the stake. In the face of such a choice, Joan would not relent, and she was eventually burned as a heretic. 20 years after her death, Charles VII was able to overturn the English conviction, and 500 years later, Joan of Arc, the teenage girl who conversed with saints, was made a saint herself. Next up, we are skipping forward a few hundred years to the 17th century and France's greatest and most ambitious ruler, Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King. Born in 1638, Louis XIV inherited the French throne at a very early age. He was brought up and taught to rule by his chief royal advisor, an Italian diplomat by the name of Jules Mazarin. This advisor was a rather interesting figure. He was extremely wealthy, and he put that wealth to good use, spending vast sums of money in the pursuit of all things pleasurable. This meant wine, art, and culture, but most importantly, women and sexual fulfillment. Jules was not, however, just a simple, mindless hedonist. He was also considered a genius when it came to politics. Now, Jules was a huge influence on the young king, becoming somewhat of a father figure. And so when Jules died and Louis took up total rule of the kingdom, he put many of his teachings to practice. Louis was a Catholic and believed very strongly in the Catholic practice of an absolute monarch having total rule over his kingdom. He therefore distanced himself from the nobility and anyone else that might have influence over his rule. One of Louis's early acts was building the magnificent palace of Versailles, an architectural jewel intended to house the king and also show off his magnificence to the French people. He also improved and expanded his army until midway through his reign, France was the most powerful country in Europe. Louis was a huge womanizer, another skill learned from his royal advisor, and he had many mistresses over the course of his life. However, he did eventually marry Maria Theresa of Spain. She bore him 6 children. Unfortunately, 5 of them died before reaching adulthood. Despite his marriage, Louis continued to have many mistresses, some of them gaining considerable power. Wanting to expand France to ever greater power in Europe, Louis spent much of his reign at war, fighting at times the Dutch, the Habsburg Empire, the Spanish, and the Swedes. His military genius brought him victory after victory. After the death of Carlos II, the Spanish emperor, Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, was in line to succeed and take over the Spanish Empire. In reality, the throne's power went to Louis, which meant he now ruled most of Europe and a huge chunk of the Americas. France was now historically at the very height of its power and influence. The good times for the Sun King were not to last forever, as for the rest of Europe this was the last straw. In 1702, William II of England formed a grand alliance with Holland, the Habsburg Empire, and other European states. Despite the aging king's best efforts, his army began to suffer defeat after defeat, and France's hold over Europe was broken. In 1715, at the age of 77, Louis died, leaving what was left of French dominion to his great-grandson Louis XV. Despite his eventual defeats, Louis XIV, the Sun King, will always be remembered as the greatest of French rulers. A quote from Napoleon says it all. Louis XIV was the only king of France worthy of the name. Next up, we are jumping in time a mere half a century to one of the greatest intellects of the Enlightenment, and a man who, in the wake of the recent atrocities in Paris, I felt had to be on this list. François-Marie Arouet, better known to the world as Voltaire. Unlike many great thinkers, Voltaire was considered a genius in his own time. Multi-talented, he was an accomplished playwright, poet, novelist, satirist, historian, and philosopher. So, yeah, quite a guy. A self-made millionaire, he, interestingly, acquired his fortune through clever manipulation of the Paris lottery. He was also one of the early true celebrities, adored by both the nobility and the common people. His acid wit made him a hot topic of controversy. However, the reason he is so important in times like these are because of his ideas and writings on morality and the way in which he helped give birth to the modern world. A world where religious superstition gave way to logic and reason. Growing up in the 18th century, Voltaire was one of the first advocates of freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and a fair and logical approach to the administration of justice. He was a key figure in birthing what we now in the modern world regard as unquestionable human rights. A dedicated writer, Voltaire produced over 350 works, the most famous being the satirical Candida. The story is about a young man who goes through a series of adventures, all the while clinging to what was then the religio-philosophical idea that everything that happens is for the best, and that we live in the best of all possible worlds. However, as the story goes on, the adventures become more and more horrific, and all evidence begins to point to the contrary. The story attacks everything from slavery to the everyday man's profession. Voltaire spent much of his life attacking the injustice and intolerance of both the Catholic Church and the French monarchy. He was a great campaigner for civil rights, and his calls for religious freedom and judicial fairness ushered in a new era for France. Voltaire, along with other Enlightenment thinkers, also raged against the barbaric practice of torture that was still being used on the accused at the time as part of the judicial system. This could include thumbscrews, the rack, sleep deprivation, suffocation, and hanging a victim by their arms with weights attached to their ankles. He argued that these methods had nothing to do with justice and risked both punishing the innocent as well as the guilty and forcing a guilty confession from the innocent. Thanks to Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers, these methods were outlawed during the latter half of the 18th century. Voltaire's book, titled Treatise on Tolerance, expanded on his belief that reason should be government's abiding principle, and that religious tolerance and freedom were a fundamental principle of modern government. By the end of his life, the name Voltaire was known throughout all of Europe, and as he lay dying in 1778, he was surrounded by a huge crowd of people, all desperate to catch a final glimpse of this legendary hero. Later, French revolutionists would erect a shrine to his name in the Pantheon. The inscription carved into it sums up Voltaire's influence on the French and Western world to a T. It simply reads, "He taught us how to be free." And finally, another short jump to the beginning of the 19th century, and to a man who needs no introduction. Napoleon Bonaparte was quite possibly the greatest emperor and general since the days of Alexander the Great and Charlemagne. And though much is now taught of his eventual defeat and the millions of deaths caused under his rule, there are also many good qualities to life under the rule of Napoleon. For example, many of the liberal values of the Enlightenment, including the metric system, religious tolerance, the idea of national self-determination, and perhaps most importantly, the Napoleonic Code of Civil Law. Quite simply, as long as political control was his, then he was tolerant of all beliefs and ideas. While it cannot be argued that millions died due to his personal ambition, he was nothing close to a mass-murdering dictator like, say, Hitler or Stalin. Napoleon's military rise to fame began in 1793, when, as an artillery expert, he played a crucial part in the defence of Toulon against the British forces. He went on to take command of the artillery in Paris against a counter-revolutionary uprising. The icing on the cake came when in 1796 he led a French army into Italy, where he was able to drive Austrian forces out of Lombardy, annexing several of the papal states, then pushing on into Austria, forcing the Austrians to sue for peace. Napoleon had now won for France most of northern Italy, the Low Countries and the Rhineland, and just as an afterthought, he also seized Venice. Returning home, Napoleon was lauded as the saviour of France. The next military campaign was into Egypt, where he seized Malta and then defeated an Egyptian force 4 times larger than his own at the Battle of the Pyramids. Despite losing the crucial sea Battle of the Nile to the British and Admiral Nelson, he pushed on into Syria. However, disease within the army eventually forced him to retreat. Returning to France, he was able to present the adventure as a success, and in 1799 was able to use his prestige to initiate a military coup. Now as first consul, he improved the road and sewage systems and reformed education, taxes, banking and the law code. This new Napoleonic law code was crucial in replacing old feudal customs with a systematized national structure. The rule of law was now fundamental to the state. Napoleon went on to crown himself emperor in 1804 and almost immediately tried to invade Britain. However, he was defeated at sea once again by Nelson at Trafalgar. It was on land that Napoleon seemed unstoppable, defeating the Austrians, Russians and Prussians. The only power to hold out against him were the British. At this point, Napoleon was at the height of his power. What followed was his infamous fall. It began when he imposed his brother Joseph as King of Spain. The Spanish revolted, and with the British providing support under Wellington, the French army found itself tied up for many years. It was during this time that the Russians began to withdraw from Napoleon's rule. In response, Napoleon amassed an army of 600,000 men to march on Russia. The Russians cleverly avoided engagement, retreating into the interior and implementing a scorched earth policy as they went. Eventually, the Russians made a stand outside Moscow, and what followed was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, the Battle of Borodino. Napoleon did take Moscow. However, with his supply lines running thin, he was forced to retreat back through Russia at the height of winter. Of the 600,000 men who set off to Russia, only 40,000 returned home to France. In the wake of Napoleon's defeat, the European powers formed an alliance against the French and defeated Napoleon's forces at the Battle of Leipzig, going on to take Paris in 1814 and sending Napoleon to the island of Elba in exile. Napoleon was not done yet. He managed to escape his exile and travelled through France back to Paris. When forces were sent to stop him, he famously said, "If any man would shoot his emperor, he may do so now." His old generals rallied to him, and on June the 18th, 1815, one final battle took place at Waterloo. Napoleon was defeated for the final time by a combined British-Prussian force, and he was once again exiled, this time to St. Helena in the South Atlantic. He died still at St. Helena in 1821. Years later, when Wellington was asked whom he thought was the greatest general, he replied, "In this age, in past ages, in any age, Napoleon."